This is a final reflection for the Digital Literacy Institute 2016. My name is Clarissa Walker, and I was a part of Tier 2. When it comes to tools, concepts, and models of leadership, the 2016 Tier 2 conference experience loaded my portfolio with pages and pages of notes. Charlie Corrow led discussions about creating a management plan using gap analysis and SWOT, which were a useful review of the nuts and bolts of these concepts. However, the handouts and checklists in the U.S. Coast Guard Performance Improvement Guide later offered instruments for actually operationalizing some of these ideas. A wonderful scene from the film Dances with Wolves demonstrated successful deliberation. And then in a keynote speech, Troy Hicks laid the groundwork for digital deliberation as an effective communication approach, which was more deeply able to crystallize for me what Murray and Hodge later addressed in the readings. This notion of project-based inquiry learning from the keynote and in the sessions caused me to revamp my syllabi and reconsider my composition classroom teaching philosophy, which was very exciting. In one session on digital writing, Troy Hicks presented maps, and while I'm pretty immersed in theoretical frameworks like maps because of the rhetorical situation in my work and in my department for my PhD program, this week definitely deepened my understanding of the leadership precepts that were explored in the trainings in business and in organizations often. My understanding of those precepts were deepened, definitely. And even if I heard the ideas in other fora, most valuable for me was the opportunity to use these ideas as a lens for evaluating the vision that I'm building in my life today. My new understanding of project-based inquiry learning has already influenced me as an educator. The Monday following the conference, I ran 4-day multimedia composition workshops for the PEP program at Rhode Island College. It was a first. I applied what I learned at the DigiURI conference. Because of the students' creativity and their willingness to play, it was what I would consider a success. In our computer lab, the writers created Atavist sites that were purely investigations of a research question that they designed on the first day, and students raved about their experience on the last day. I did learn a great deal from this experience. Naturally, I'm reflecting on ways to improve this for my stakeholders, the students. The workshop needs a unifying artifact, such as the documentary currently playing called Half the Sky. I'm choosing this to focus our inquiry and to speed up the front end of the process. What I think I did well was share the vision from the start. I used a New York Times Pulitzer Prize winning piece by John Branch called Snowfall, which I'll show later. And the students were able to create an atavist, and I showed them also an atavist that I created, something that I knew nothing about until I was in a session at DigiURI. In the Reeves reading, culture is defined as the bedrock values, traditions, or practices. This change caused me to rethink classroom culture. I'm having to think about what the classroom will look like with a computer lab being our main setting, which had happened before, with students needing to be in class with headphones on as they curate and review video to embed into the Atavist. And of course, my role being more of a one-on-one instructor, small group conferencing, kind of moving away from the mini lecturing, the mini lectures that were required before or that were a part of what I did before. While I could say much more, I'm going to kind of fly through the key insights for the readings or things that I took away from. In the U.S. Coast Guard Leadership Performance Improvement Guide, it was a great method for identifying and assessing stakeholders. I thought that the way that, I love the word affinitize, but the way that it was actually giving instructions on how groups and grouping could occur so that you can group stakeholders with like interests. I remember Chris Lehman in his discussion of parents and students and teachers. He said stakeholders a great deal, and each of those stakeholders and their relationship to the vision was very different. So I really liked the way the stakeholders were handled in that particular text and reading. The second thing in this particular one was I really like to be reminded of the nature of goal language. The SMART model was revisited here: specific, measurable, action oriented, realistic, time based. I guess because I'm a composition and rhetoric person, I like it that it was very specific about the nature of this language. Um, this reminded me of Charlie Coyro's discussion of goals and how to communicate goals, how to communicate a shared vision, particularly in tools like the elevator speech. More specifically, I really liked in terms of the tools, the checklist. I like the meeting checklist in that text, in the Coast Guard text. And it really gave us a way to operationalize these things that could remain theoretical if we didn't take them to a place of operating in them. This was my first time reading Cotter, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. One particular quote that stood out to me is, "Until changes sink deeply into the company's culture, new approaches are fragile and subject to regression." This reminded me of Reese Donick's keynote when he talked about the necessity of ubiquitous and invisible technology as an integral part of school building and in the education landscape. Otherwise, it is not sinking deeply into the culture of the education landscape. A couple of very specific things that I drew from that text was I like the distinguishing of a transformation vision. I think a transformation vision is something very specific and is delivered by a guiding coalition. Transformation as opposed to new vision, which can be off-putting to people who have put in a lot of time and have seniority in a particular environment. Transformation vision seemed really, really powerful to me. Guiding coalition, I have questions about, but it stood out to me. Powerful, titled, influential people being the ones to usher in change from the beginning, very top down in its feel. And the first thing I thought about was, I wonder what Cotter and Freire, a conversation between the two of them would be like. Paulo Freire. The second and final thing in the Cotter reading that I walked away with, was this idea of removing obstacles to the new vision, capturing the hearts and minds of the troops. So you remove the obstacles and you must capture the hearts and minds of the new troops. And the way that you do that, which I also liked, is giving you like what must be done and how it's done, is that you must have good, consistent, credible communication and the vision embedded in the culture. You can't have like the only time the vision is alive is in meetings, and then at the water bubbler, everything, all of the managers are saying something totally different. I got that, and I really appreciated that point in the Cotter reading. In the Reeves reading, it was certainly less top down than the Cotter model. And I really like this point about pulling the weeds before planting new flowers. I think that does line up with Cotter's discussion about removing the obstacles, and it reminds me of not putting new wine in old wine skins. I love that quote. So the other thing that I thought about from the Institute was Yanti's discussion of the technology mentor a pyramid, and how to pace your change, the change that you are kind of being the steward of. And so sustaining excellence, I'm all about that. I think when I want to do a quick podcast, I'll sit down and put some slides together and do a screencast because I feel like that's a little bit closer to excellence than something that's a little bit less, or do an atavist for the assignment. In my mind, that's kind of working that muscle. So I am a proponent of that. As a motivator, it ties to permanence. You embed change into the culture, and it must be the mantra of the mentor. Excellence must be the mantra of the mentors in an environment. Very quickly, I really appreciated Murray's definition, very succinct and clear definition of deliberation, social deliberation, the capacity to engage skillfully in dialogue. And because it became a little bit, I could detect small differences in the Hodges definition, which comes a little bit later. Breaking out capacities was very, very useful and pronounced in this reading. Social perspective monitoring, social perspective seeking and weighing, those kinds of capacities were actually outlined as abilities, actual abilities, which was great. And to me, I interpreted that as the ability to question, an ability to listen closely, an ability to compare and contrast available views, the ability to instinctively go to people who could be perceived as experts or guides. And also going back to the Dances with Wolves reference, it kind of reminds me of what we saw in that scene. I think I'll always associate deliberation with that movie now. Two things I most appreciated from the Hodges reading on deliberation was simply that there was a statement about this way of doing things provides a common ground where citizens engage in public action. Action happening at the intersections was emphasized. And this is a little bit different than the previous definition of deliberation. I really like that Hodge offers this great chart that differentiates between a debate and deliberation, because as someone who teaches argumentation, I think that that's really helpful. I think that that could be a point of confusion, particularly for students who have been taught that you have a thesis statement and you defend it, and your point is to convince everybody how right you are, and having the goals be so very different in deliberation. I think that this kind of tool, this kind of instrument really helps. And I like that it was just like a straight across, like in debate, you search for glaring differences. In deliberation, deliberation involves concern for others. It is a very selfless act. You do more listening than proving, and it goes against everything we've mostly been taught to date. And the Kunda Anderson Wolk reading on curation was really one of my favorites because I feel that it is tied somehow to my dissertation work. I like this very clean definition of a set of interdisciplinary activities that address the need to curate, manage, use, and add value to digital assets over time. Really a reflection of where we are right now. I marvel at the fact in 15 years we won't have these problems, because hopefully all of these things will be worked out. But we're at a place where we lack an infrastructure for the thing we use most, which is the internet and online work. Two elements like a checklist for is institutional stewardship, which is the preservation or commitment to preserving, not just doing, taking care of a blog for, as the U.S. Coast Guard pointed out, like when you have a vision or you have something in place, it needs to outlive at least a couple of leaders. So having something that's more or less of a leader guided effort, but an institutional stewardship that will preserve